the real disruption, the real value to be created, and the real improvements that can be made in clinical outcomes and patient satisfaction, even in overall cost decrease in healthcare, are going to come from consumer-facing tech companies that see the value in healthcare, see the value to be created in healthcare, and are not willing to play by those same rules of we're going to do fee for service, for example, and we're going to build these CPT codes. Hey there, Rafi Salazar from the Better Outcomes Show here. And this week we're taking a dive into healthcare innovation. Where's it going to come from? Who's going to be responsible for it? And I'm going to throw out the hot take that I threw out a while back, that it's not going to come from healthcare. So let's dive right in. So this idea came from a post I made on LinkedIn a while back, and it was part of a conversation that we had a while back on the podcast, maybe about reading or something like that. I think it was how reading tangentially or even outside of your industry can give you insights that you can apply to your industry, specifically in our case, healthcare. And I mentioned it in passing, and that clip got a lot of feedback, a lot of email responses. So I said, you know what? Maybe this is worth having an entire episode dedicated to this idea. So I'm just going to start with the beginning, and that was a prediction. And the prediction was that over the next 5 to 10 years, the big innovations and advances that we're going to see in healthcare, probably around healthcare service delivery models, are going to come from outside of healthcare. Particularly, my thought here is that they're going to come from like the B2C consumer-facing tech marketplaces, things like Amazon's, Walmart, things like that. They're not going to come from healthcare companies and organizations, these big giant conglomerates like United Health Group that owns insurance companies and clinics and, authorization and like third-party administrators, because all of those organizations are built upon an infrastructure now that exists within healthcare that is really invested in making sure the status quo is maintained, particularly around how healthcare is bought, paid for, and sold, right? Like that is, when we talk about real innovation in healthcare, the big thing that we're thinking about, or at least I'm thinking about, is how are we paying for healthcare? How is the way or the system that we have currently set up for paying for and delivering healthcare kind of incentivizing and entrenching us in some of these big problems that we have, right? Like incentives matter. I think that's a Henry Hazlitt quote, right, from Economics in One Lesson. Incentives matter. And particularly in healthcare, we're in this space where it might be time-based, they might be service-based, whatever, but unless you're submitting billable codes, CPT codes, to an insurance company, you're typically not getting paid in healthcare, in mainstream healthcare. Sure, like there's some small niches and things like that are doing, direct to consumer, non-covered services. But for the most part, even those companies are applying this business model of healthcare of we do this, we build this service, and you pay us for it. That's essentially what it is. It's the way I'm looking at it. This is not something that's like a hot take that's going to go away. It's me saying that healthcare disruption and innovation is going to come from some of these consumer-facing tech companies really is based on my experience over the last 12 years in healthcare, watching kind of the slow, lumbering response from traditional healthcare organizations, right? I think they've been talking about like value-based care since I was a grad student in 2010, so 15 years ago. And the talk back then was at some point we're not going to be billing fee for service and value-based care is going to happen and we're going to get paid for the value we create or the outcomes we deliver and not so much the CPT codes and the time that we spend with patients. And that has obviously taken on some forms here and there, but it is not anywhere near where they were predicting it was going to be 15 years ago, right? Most clinical organizations are still stuck trying to either like digitize their outdated workflows, like how are we bolt on telehealth to this, or how do we bolt on remote patient monitoring, remote therapeutic monitoring to this? How do we make these innovations fit within this model of healthcare where we have to see patients for a certain amount of time and build these codes? And that's really what's hampered a lot of the innovation. I've seen it as a consultant helping and an advisor helping some of these companies go to market in the musculoskeletal space. Some of my clients have developed things that are really, really cool, really have the ability, they're clinically efficacious. They have the ability to really decrease the cost the end user is going to have to bear. So the patients are going to have to bear, maybe sometimes even the insurance companies. And the big hang up is one of two things. Either the customers that they're selling to, so provider organizations primarily, see the potential in this tool, this service, this solution, and their hang up is, how do I bill for it? I can't figure out a way to bill for it. It's not fitting within my current workflows. And there's something to be said about that, but it's really a hamper. The other reaction that we get with some of these products and services is clinicians and clinical organizations just see it as a threat, as it's going to remove the number of visits that I can bill for, Rafi, for example. Instead of being able to see him 2 times a week in the PT space, for example, for 6 weeks, now maybe he's only got to come 1 time a week. So I'm going to half my visits. That's all, I'm going to cut my revenue in half. And they're losing the forest for the trees, right? They're stuck in what does this service or this product do to my current business model? How does it impact the way that, in this case, it's going to decrease the number of visits, decrease the revenue I have, and not looking at it as the opportunity. You can see twice as many patients, basically, right? So it's one of those things where when we think about how do you disrupt an organization or an industry, especially a big industry like healthcare, oftentimes what you'll see is that you'll get these big giant conglomerates, the mainstream way of doing business, and that just kind of gets reinforced. And then you've got like other sub industries that get built on top of that, right? Like how many revenue cycle management companies don't want to see value-based care come around, because then they're not going to be able to bill as much, or they're not going to be able to manage their workflows of billing these CPT codes and getting reimbursed. And when I mean value-based care, I mean like, let's think real innovation, something like subscription healthcare, right? Something like your Amazon Prime membership gives you access to a primary care physician that you can see twice a year, and some sort of discounted or decreased maybe musculoskeletal care or something like that, right? Something where those, like Amazon's not going to get into the game of billing insurance. They're not going to submit CPT codes to UHC. They're just going to charge the consumer direct for it and trust that they're delivering enough value to keep those patients or those customers coming back again and again and again, right? Utilizing that service. So let's talk about in particular, why is healthcare itself not built to disrupt itself, right? I've already mentioned the infrastructure piece. Much of healthcare is structured around this fee-for-service billing, right? It rewards volume, not value in a lot of cases. For the most part, providers, the more providers bill, the more they get paid. So the incentive means more appointments, higher volume, cases where you can, in some cases where they've got maybe some sort of value-based arrangement or shared risk arrangement or something like that, where you're only taking those complex patients, or you're going back and you're trying to review patient files to see if you can upcode them or something like that. It actively resists innovation that can reduce those visits or the number of billed units or everything like that. EMRs and billing softwares are designed for compliance, but not for efficiency or the patient experience. So a lot of these EMR companies that are out there are built for how do you maximize billable productivity or utilization in a way that keeps you compliant, but that doesn't necessarily pay a whole lot of attention or care for decreasing the cost to the patient or the insurance company. It's really about maximizing revenue for their customer, which makes sense, right? That's the incentive, that's the market, that's the target customer. So their value proposition is we're going to allow you to bill more, get paid quicker. But the the incentive isn't how do we save the system as a whole, how do we innovate what you're doing, how do we change the way you're collecting or monetizing your healthcare service. It's not about that. It's about building on top of what's currently there, the constraints in which you're working with, which there's something to be said about. I think on a podcast a while back, I mentioned constraint-based thought experiments with your business and how good that can be. Like, okay, I'm stuck billing fee-for-service in healthcare. How do I maximize that, right? Like, that's the constraint I'm working with. We're going to be insurance-based. How do we build a profitable business? And there's some value to that because that can help you increase the efficiency, for example, in your organization. But it doesn't really improve or work towards innovation. So a lot of the constraint-based thought processes or constraint-based experiments when it comes to healthcare are really efficiency plays. And I heard this somewhere, I can't remember what book I read it in, but innovation comes at the cost of efficiency. You cannot be hyper efficient and also innovative, because innovative moves or innovations require some trial and error, right? That didn't work, so we're gonna have to scrap it and pivot to something else. Or this might be an initial outlay of capital, maybe something that's maybe inefficient, that's costing us money on the billable side, but in the long run, it'll create value down the line. If you're running a giant organization, you're not incentivized to lose any capital or money or revenue, right? You're incentivized to take what you've got, to take this thing that you've built a lot of infrastructure and processes and systems, and try to make that become more hyper profitable for you, rather than disrupting it or pitching it to the side, right? Maybe there's some sunk cost fallacy going on there in order to pivot into a different business model or a reimbursement model or something like that. So currently in healthcare, there is this. And I mentioned this before in the book, Better Outcomes, A Guide to Humanizing Healthcare. I mentioned it on several podcasts. We've talked about it on the show several times. But this idea that what is currently at play here in healthcare is this misaligned incentives between really the three major players, and we're going to leave policymakers out of this, but providers, payers, and patients, right? The payer system currently that we've got, this fee-for-service model, even if it's not time-based, if it's service-based, you've got this incentive set up where patients want to get better, right? They want to do it at the lowest cost, the quickest time for themselves. Providers on the other side want to maximize the amount that they're able to bill with the least amount of time for each patient. And then payers on the final side here are looking at how do they run a profitable business while decreasing healthcare spend. And if you're in a fee-for-service model, the only way that, or the only levers that payers have to pull are I can either not approve as much, so decrease the amount of services that are being paid for or reimbursed, or decrease the amount that I'm paying for each service, right? So you're either decreasing the fee schedule or the allowable amount, or you're just straight out denying. And we've seen organizations come under fire for that recently. United Healthcare seems to be the whipping boy of the day. But they got into trouble a while back. This is 2025 that I'm recording this. They got in trouble maybe the tail end of 2024, early 2025 for using like AI algorithms for authorizations, and they were screening out and denying services, and the public gets all kind of bent out of shape about this. But if you look at their business model and what they're dealing with an exorbitant amount of claims coming through, and the only levers that they have to pull are decreasing how much they're paying for providers, and they can't do that wholesale or they'll end up losing a whole bunch of providers in their network. And they can't go out and just flat deny everything. So they're walking this tightrope of how do we deny enough that maybe through the appeals process, so many people just won't even come back for it, and that'll weed out people that it's really not medically necessary. And how do we decrease on this side how much we're paying the providers, not enough to drive them away, but enough to keep them around because we provide enough patient volume for them, right? And that's the tightrope that every insurance payer or a healthcare insurance provider is trying to walk. United Healthcare just happens to be one of the biggest ones, so they're kind of the times they run astray or something like that, it tends to be bigger issue or bigger zeros or a higher number of zeros attached to those problems, right? But there's this misaligned incentive in healthcare where the payers now are dealing with these providers that are seeing, okay, on the provider side, they're either denying the number that they're going to give, they're lowering the number of visits, for example, that they're going to provide or approve, and they're going to decrease the amount they're paying us, which means that now I need to bill more, see more, so it's this cat and mouse game, right? The payers trying to stamp out wasteful spend as they see it, and providers are trying to fight declining reimbursements and increased administrative burden of dealing with denials and authorizations and things like that. And then in the middle is the patient that just wants to get better. They don't want to, if they can be seen in, let's use physical therapy as an example, if they can get the same results in 6 visits as in 12 visits, they want to do 6, right? Because that's less co-pays for them, less time for them, faster road to recovery, ideally. So you've got all of these incentives, and you can see that none of them are really aligning. There's never a time where, in a fee-for-service model, where the provider and the payer, for example, are aligned that we're only going to see X number of visits for this amount of money, because that's just not how it works, right? The provider's trying to maximize how much they can get, and the payer's trying to minimize their spend. So everyone is working against each other here. Instead of like collaborating to like how do we improve outcomes and decrease costs for everybody. And there are some groups out there, some organizations that have started doing things like shared saving programs. I know Anthem is doing this in our geographic location, where it's like, okay, you get in one of these shared risk models with Anthem, and let's say the benchmark for rehabilitation for a total knee replacement is 16 visits nationwide. If you're part of this program and you can get the patient to the same clinical outcome in 8 visits, for example, instead of 16, Anthem will pay you a portion of that savings, right? So they saved 50%, they'll give you a portion of that. And that's kind of moving in the right direction. But then you're still dealing with the calculus on the provider side of, okay, we still need to maximize, because the goal now is to try to decrease the number of visits, which means we need to maximize what we're billing in each visit, and we need to work on getting more patient volume in, right? And all of this kind of builds together to kind of put us in a situation where we're not dealing with real innovation. We're dealing with like a slow pace of like an efficiency play. We're getting a little bit more efficient. We're getting a little bit more efficient for this type of patient, for this type of payer, for this population, but we're not doing any kind of wholesale cost reduction or anything that would really decrease the burden, the financial burden that healthcare places on employers, on patients, even on providers and payers themselves, right? And then that's just the the reimbursement side of things. We're not even talking about like credentialing, payer negotiations, administrative burdens for like getting authorization and stuff like that. That's just, it all gets piled on top of that, right? So then we turn to, okay, if healthcare itself can't or won't or is not incentivized to disrupt this problem, we all agree there's a problem. We all know, like if you talk to an insurance provider, for example, they'll tell you like, listen, this is a problem that we're dealing with. Providers that are trying to upcharge and overcharge and maximize their billable amount for each patient that walks through the door, really at the cost sometimes of long-term outcomes maybe, or whatever. And it's not good for us, the payer, right? You talk to any provider and you're going to say, listen, I don't know how I can make ends meet when I keep getting a fee reduction every year. The number of visits gets reduced. The amount that's being authorized is being reduced. So every year I'm dealing with a decrease in my revenue, an increased administrative burden in order to do the same services I was doing before. And if you talk to patients, they're like, I don't know. I have to pay, the amount I have to pay every month is going higher and higher. Whatever. I can't find a provider that's in network with my insurance company now, which means I'm paying more out of pocket. Whatever the problem is, it's causing a problem. You talk to anybody in the healthcare space or who has touched healthcare, and they will tell you specifically in the United States, like, this is a problem. We know there's a problem. It could be better, right? So if healthcare, the players within healthcare are not in a position to, or not incentivized because they've sunk so much into building this infrastructure around like a fee-for-service model of service delivery, who is poised to disrupt healthcare? I've mentioned it before, but I'm going to circle back to it. It's going to be these consumer-facing tech giants, right? Amazon, for example, they've acquired some pharmacies, some medical, I think it's One Medical and PillPack, I think, are the pharmacy aspect of things. Apple, for example, is using wearables to collect like continuous biometric data. Walmart is rolling out like physical health clinics all over its huge retail footprint. So you can see it happening on the tech side already. These consumer-facing companies, that they see a value there, and they're trying to figure out how to make it work in a way that's scalable for them, that's profitable for them, but that still incentivizes patients, or in this case their customers, to come back again and again, to use their services, to utilize maybe a subscription or something like that. But what makes these companies different is the fact that they're not constrained by billing codes or pre-auth forms or falling into the traditional model of healthcare delivery, right? They're product first. They're a lot of times they're hyper user focused, right? Like they want to decrease the barriers or the friction that users might experience in accessing a service or something. And that's something that healthcare really is non-existent in healthcare in a lot of ways. But like Amazon cares that it takes a customer 2 extra clicks to check out, right? Like that's something they want to eliminate. That's why they created like one-click checkout and stuff like that. They're trying to decrease the friction for the customer or the consumer to receive whatever service, whatever benefit, whatever product they're seeking for and ready to buy now. They want to decrease that friction so that they can get it right now. They see healthcare, a lot of these tech giants do, not so much as an RCM or a medical billing challenge, but really as a tech and a logistics or a workflow challenge, right? It's not just a regulatory one. They want to look at, okay, how do we develop one, maybe a product, a healthcare product or something like that people want, and then decrease the friction for them getting it, and then increasing the value that those customers experience, receive, or perceive in that value. So that frees them up to build usually better, faster, and more convenient services in other industries. And now they're pivoting they're turning their focus and their attention towards healthcare, which can mean that over the next several years, we're going to see some real big movements from some of these big companies trying to improve the healthcare experience while delivering value, right? Because for them, like for Amazon, for example, if you don't find value in Amazon Prime, you don't renew, and they're out that customer, right? So they're trying to incentivize, maybe we'll call it Amazon Health or something like that. They're going to be incentivized to make sure that they're building their subscriber base, and they're reducing churn, which means they're going to be focused on increasing the value that those members perceive or experience in their services. It also means that they're going to be able to monetize outside of traditional models, right? Maybe they bundle healthcare with affiliate deals or Amazon vendors who are delivering, for example, selling healthcare devices. Maybe they find some way to monetize through that. Or maybe they bundle, I mentioned it before, maybe Amazon bundles some primary care or some teledoc or telehealth with a Prime membership. So you get a Prime membership and you get a couple free telehealth visits a year or something like that. Apple might monetize maybe through hardware or app subscriptions, for example. They don't need CPT codes in this case because they're not billing health insurance companies. These are all like add-on services because their business model isn't built on this third-party payer and reimbursement. So these are just some thoughts that I have on like healthcare innovation and how it's going to come from, in my opinion, a lot of these large consumer-facing tech-forward companies, right? What does this mean for healthcare providers? it means that we need to recognize that this change is on the horizon, and we need to begin rethinking our value proposition, right? Like being in network isn't enough anymore. I've always said that like being in network with an insurance company is really just a provider's way of avoiding having a value conversation with a patient. We rely on a lot of times being in network is doing the sales for us as opposed to like having a conversation with a patient. What are your goals? What are your outcomes? Yes, it looks like we have alignment, that we have the expertise and the ability to provide this outcome to you, and this is how much it's going to cost, and this is why it costs that much, right? Does that seem like something that's valuable to you as the patient or the consumer here, or not? If so, let's have a discussion. Let's figure out how we can make it work. Those conversations are not being had when you're in network, because the question that even the patient has is, do you take my insurance, yes or no? You bypass that whole value conversation, right? I would think that what we want to begin doing as healthcare providers is begin looking at how to embrace hybrid models of care, maybe virtual first. I've said asynchronous, membership-based, with the idea of one, maybe augmenting the revenue that we are able to bring into our organizations now, but really putting us in a position to capitalize on some of these new models when they come down the line, right? And that's kind of what I got so far. Like I said, this was one of those, I'd made this post on LinkedIn, got some feedback, and thought, you know what, this is worth having, doing a podcast episode on just disruption in healthcare and how it's going to come from the outside, at least in my opinion. And then maybe some things we can think about as healthcare providers. So I think the main takeaway is going to be, like, if you're waiting for the system, healthcare, to approve your idea or to fix itself, like, you've already lost the battle here. Innovation, in a lot of cases, doesn't need permission. I think this is going to be, the next several years is also going to be like the golden years for independent private healthcare practices who are nimble enough to implement some of these things, to make some of these partnerships, make some of these agreements, to implement new monetization strategies and see what works. So anyways, if you like the show, head on over to iTunes, leave us a rating and review. It helps people find us. I'd love to know your thoughts. If you think there's if you think that I missed something, or you have a perspective you want to add, shoot me a message on LinkedIn. Or shoot me an email, Rafi at, actually no, the new email address is me@RafiSalazar.com. Shoot me an email, and we can start a conversation, maybe even do a podcast episode on some kind of innovation that you've developed or something like that. So yeah, I think that's it. So until the next time, folks, be safe, be healthy. I will talk to you then.
Thanks for listening to another episode of the Better Outcome Show with Rafi Salazar. This episode was brought to you by Strata PT. Strata PT is a single EMR platform and revenue cycle management service for physical, occupational, and speech therapy practices that helps you achieve a 99.99% reimbursement rate. If you'd like to learn more about Strata PT and see how their EMR and RCM works, head over to stratapt.com to book a demo.